Hello to you all. My name is Eilish Angelini and I'm the principal of St Hugh's College. I'm delighted to welcome you all here today to what promises to be a fascinating lecture from our great Professor Erin Saupe. The lecture this evening doesn't have what you might describe as a very cheery title, but I'm sure it's going to be absolutely fascinating on mass extinctions. We're so pleased to be joined by alumni and friends around the world, particularly this afternoon. Here in Oxford, it's been a crispy autumnal day. It's now dark, but I know that we have people from all over the planet joining us, so it may well be that some of you are preparing to go to bed and others indeed have just got up, but I'm sure you'll be transfixed during this lecture. Wherever you are watching, we hope that you and your loved ones are keeping safe and very well in these particularly challenging times we all live in. It's my very great pleasure to introduce our wonderful fellow, Professor Erin Saupe, who will be discussing her research on mass extinctions and how this work is relevant to the current crisis facing us today. Erin is a tutorial fellow at St Hugh's and an associate professor of paleobiology in the Department of Earth Sciences here at the University of Oxford. Her research focuses on determining the factors that promote speciation, extinction, and shifts in species distributions over Earth history. We have been sent lots of questions, as you can imagine, and Erin will try her very best to answer as many of these as possible, and we hope to have time to answer more questions during the course of it. But you'll appreciate that she will not perhaps be able to get to all of them during the time that we have available to us. I'd like to close by expressing my particular thanks to all of you who made a donation to the college's COVID-19 fund. It's a support fund which is extremely valuable to us in these very challenging times, and I'm very, very grateful to you all. Your support means so much, particularly into the future when the exact future of the college is not entirely certain over the next couple of years. And I hand over to Erin, who should be ready to greet you now.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Eilish, and thank you everyone for being here. I am going to share my screen now and talk to you about the end of the world as we know it, mass extinctions, past, present, and future. So as Eilish said, I am a paleontologist, which means that I study past life. I specifically am interested in how life evolves, why life goes extinct, how species respond to environmental and climatic changes through time. And I'm interested in the coevolution of Earth and life, meaning the effects of Earth systems on life and vice versa. When you think of a paleontologist, you may think of someone like Alan Grant from Jurassic Park, going into the field and digging up dinosaurs. But I actually do most of my work on the computer using statistical modeling platforms to better understand the evolution of life on Earth. And today I'm going to talk to you about some of that work, as well as some of my collaborators' work on the most alluring times in Earth history, mass extinction events. Before we can discuss the who, what, and where of mass extinctions, though, we need to first familiarize ourselves with Earth's distant past. So some of you may already know this, but for those of you who don't know this, the Earth is approximately 4.5 billion years old. Life likely arose 3.8 to 4 billion years ago, but it's not until about 3.2 billion years ago that we get our first confident fossils of single-celled bacteria. After these single-celled bacteria evolve, we have to wait another 2.6 billion years to get our first truly macroscopic animal fossils that most of you will be familiar with. Things like this trilobite here, and then much later, ammonites and dinosaurs. It's really difficult to imagine 4.5 billion years of Earth history. It's an almost inconceivable amount of time. And one way that we can contextualize when events occurred in Earth history is by scaling geological time to recent human events. So for example, we can take the Norman conquest of England in 1066, when William the Conqueror came over and took over England, and we can set that as the beginning of Earth history 4.5 billion years ago. And then of course, then today would be the present reign of the Windsors. And using this scale then, these trilobites here would have actually lived during the reign of Queen Victoria. And then this ammonite and these dinosaurs here would have originated and lived from 1966 to 2004. And actually, in fact, most of the fossil record that we know that comes from the last 550 million years of Earth history is actually no older than St. Hugh's College when scaled to the English monarchies. And if we think about modern humans evolved about 2 million years ago. So that means that scaled to the English monarchies, humans would have evolved only in the last half year, so in 2020. As life was evolving on Earth, so too was the Earth actually evolving. So Earth's continents have moved towards each other, away from each other. They've moved past each other throughout time. And this movement of Earth's continents on what we call continental plates has actually caused earthquakes. It's responsible for volcanoes. It's responsible for building mountains. And it's responsible for the opening and closing of ocean basins through time. And these large-scale processes have influenced the evolution of life on Earth and have also contributed to the extinction of life on Earth. And they're actually still occurring today. So this process of plate movement is ongoing today, will continue to occur into the future. So for example, a new ocean basin is actually forming right now along the East African Rift right here. And this ocean basin is forming by the plates being pulled apart. And eventually, in 10 million years' time, this part of Africa, so Ethiopia, Tanzania, Somalia, Kenya, will actually be its own separate island from the rest of Africa. Another example of dynamic changes that are occurring today is the formation of mountains. So mountains form when two plates come together or when they collide. And today this is happening as India is pressing into Eurasia, forming the Himalayas. So India was actually a separate landmass or island 50 million years ago. And about 40 million years ago, it docked or slammed into the Eurasian continent. And today it's still pushing into the Eurasian continent. And this is actually making the Himalayas ever taller by about 1 centimeter a year. So if any of you have ever climbed Mount Everest before, I'm sad to say that you haven't actually climbed the highest mountain as it's continually getting higher. So it's within this context of a dynamic, evolving Earth that life has also evolved. And today on Earth, there are about 8.7 million species. And there were likely this many species at numerous other times in the distant past. However, there were also times in Earth history when there were far fewer species, particularly after what we call mass extinction events. And so to understand a mass extinction, we first need to define what is extinction itself. So extinction is the end of a particular type of organism. Extinction occurs, for example, when the last individual of the dodo perished or the last individual of the passenger pigeon died. And extinction is a natural process. It's occurred throughout Earth history. And indeed, paleontologists like myself think that 99.9% of all species that have ever lived are actually now extinct. However, there were times in Earth history when there were massive amounts of extinction, and we refer to these events as mass extinction events. And essentially, we can define a mass extinction as a sharp increase in extinction over a short period of time that results in a significant and prolonged reduction in global biodiversity. So the Earth suddenly houses far fewer species than it used to after a mass extinction event. And we can look to the fossil record to determine when mass extinctions have actually occurred. And we can do this by estimating the extinction rate. So the rate of extinction is the number of species that go extinct per unit time. This is usually measured in per million years. And remember that most of the fossil record we have is from the last 550 to 500 million years. So we can then use this fossil record to actually estimate rates of past extinction, which looks something like this red curve that you can see here. And we can then get a background rate of extinction, sort of an average level of extinction that we would expect during most of Earth history. And that's represented by this blue shading here. And whenever we see extinction go significantly above this blue rate of background extinction, those are our episodes of mass extinction. And it turns out that there are 5 in Earth history, starting with the late Ordovician, the late Devonian, the late Permian, the late Triassic, and most famously, the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction, when the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct. So mass extinctions wipe out a lot of species in a relatively short period of time. But how bad were mass extinctions really? Well, the answer is pretty bad. These charts are based on marine extinctions, and you can see that up to 83% of genera perished in the late Permian extinction here, which is our largest mass extinction event, and up to 73% of genera perished in the late Triassic extinction. And that essentially means that most of life died out at these events. Okay, so what caused such massive amounts of extinction? The answer is that it's varied and it depends on the event, but mass extinctions were almost always caused by some large-scale environmental change or perturbation. And it was often associated with the movement of Earth's continental plates. Things like an asteroid impact, large-scale glaciations, global cooling, sea level fall, large-scale volcanism, and therefore global warming, and sea level rise. And actually, large-scale volcanic activity or large igneous provinces are associated with virtually all of the mass extinction events in Earth history, aside from the first, the late Ordovician. And what is a large igneous province? Well, a large igneous province is essentially an extremely large accumulation of magma and lava. And why are large igneous provinces so harmful and such potent agents of mass extinction? It's because they emit large amounts of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. And these greenhouse gases, of course, cause global warming. And global warming, of course, then results in extinction. Not only can global warming cause extinction, though, just directly by exceeding the thermal tolerances of species, it can also reduce the levels of oxygen in the ocean. So it can create what we call ocean anoxia. And this itself can also lead to extinction. Large igneous provinces also emit other dangerous gases like halogen gases, and these can cause stratospheric ozone destruction. And this, as a result, can lead to the sterilization of plants. And that, of course, is very bad because plants serve as the base of our food chain. And so if you shut off the base of the food chain, you can have these cataclysmic effects or a cascade of extinction, both on land and in the marine realm. So just as an example, our largest known large igneous province is the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, otherwise known as CAMP. This was extruded in the late Triassic about 200 million years ago. And basically, what happened during this event is that 3 million cubic kilometers of lava was extruded over 300,000 years. And to put this into perspective, Mount Pinatubo, which erupted in 1991, extruded about 10 cubic kilometers of lava and killed about 847 people. Tambora in 1815 extruded about 160 cubic kilometers of lava and killed about 102,000 people. And the Laki eruption, which was in Iceland, extruded about 14 cubic kilometers of lava and killed over 6 million people. The reason that the Laki event had such a strong effect is that it shut or changed global climatic patterns. So it caused cooling, which resulted in crop failures, and that resulted in famine. It caused warming, which resulted in droughts, which also resulted in deaths. And then it also emitted so many poisonous gases, which were dangerous to humans, that also directly caused deaths, including here in England. So to put this in perspective then, the CAMP event in the late Triassic 200 million years ago basically was a Laki-sized eruption every 1.5 years for 300,000 years. And given this scale, you can begin to see why large igneous provinces can wreak so much havoc on life and why such a small scale eruption like Laki can have such a large effect. Okay, so the largest mass extinction event in Earth history was also associated with a large igneous province, and it occurred at the end of the Permian period about 251 million years ago. And the event coincides with the eruption of the Siberian traps, which are a large igneous province in Siberia that's about the size of the United States. So you can see this is the extent of the lava that has been extruded by the Siberian traps, which is basically the size of the United States. So this is a huge area of lava. And this mass extinction event is referred to as the Great Dying. And that's because basically almost all of life on Earth perished at this event. We estimate 96% of species and 83% of genera went extinct. And that's because there were these massive greenhouse gas emissions from the Siberian traps that essentially caused global warming of around 10 degrees Celsius. That then led to a reduction in oceanic oxygen of up to 80%. It also released and depleted the ozone such that harmful UVB rays could cause plant and algal death, which of course then collapsed marine and terrestrial ecosystems. And one of the only taxa to survive this really serious mass extinction event on land was Lystrosaurus, which is depicted here. And for thousands of years, Lystrosaurus actually made up 95% of all land vertebrates. And that's because essentially almost all of other life had already died out. There's a number of hypotheses for why this cute little Lystrosaurus made it and other taxa didn't. None of them are very well supported, but it perhaps has to do with this species being a generalist, perhaps being able to go into a hibernation-like state, and also able to survive low oxygen conditions. So at the time of this mass dying and the Permian mass extinction, all of the continents were actually connected together in one super big landmass called Pangaea. And an organism could actually walk all the way from Vladivostok in Russia, which is a port city in Russia, to Sydney if they so desired or were so inclined. And actually this configuration of continents, the fact that all of the continents were smushed together into one huge landmass, made the interior of Pangaea, of the supercontinent, really hot and really dry, very much like the Sahara Desert today. And as the Siberian traps were emitting more and more greenhouse gases, which was increasing global temperatures, it made it very intolerable in the tropics, so much so that probably there was very little life living at tropical latitudes. The other issue with this supercontinent configuration is that it made it especially difficult to regulate climate and to draw down CO2 and those greenhouse gases as they were being emitted. So this made it especially warm during the late Permian. And there are actually estimates that sea surface temperatures at the time reached almost 40 degrees C. So that's pretty nice if you're in the hot tub maybe for 5 minutes, but not so great if you're an animal that lives in the sea. This temperature, 40 degrees Celsius, is when proteins begin to denature in animals and they can begin to experience heat shock. So these conditions would have caused severe distress to most organisms, both on land and in the sea, and likely caused the vacation of the tropics, meaning that there was very little life living at low latitudes. After this great dying event, it took another 50 million years for the next mass extinction event at the end of the Triassic. This mass extinction event, as I already mentioned, was associated with the Camp Large Igneous Province. And the Camp eruption caused a cascade of biological effects leading to extinction and eventually the demise of these crocodile-like reptiles. And as well as this entire group of organisms, which we call conodonts, which look a bit like eels. It also hit reefs very hard, and you had a significant restructuring of reefs after this extinction event. This extinction event, so these dying off of these crocodilian-like reptiles, actually paved the way for dinosaurs to take over the Jurassic. Then these dinosaurs, of course, were soon obliterated by the asteroid that hit the Earth at the end of the Cretaceous 66 million years ago. So Earth's most famous and recent mass extinction event occurred when an asteroid that was probably about 10 kilometers in diameter famously hit the Yucatan Peninsula off of Mexico, killing all of the non-avian dinosaurs. Again, this happened 66 million years ago. And this asteroid impact likely was the primary cause of the mass extinctions that we see at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. But some extinction was also likely caused, again, by a large igneous province. And in this case, it's a large igneous province that we call the Deccan Traps. And the Deccan Traps were out at around the same time, erupting about 500,000 cubic kilometers of lava across much of what is today India and also into the deep sea. And this asteroid impact that hit the Earth off of Mexico likely caused near total darkness from the dust and ejecta that blocked the atmosphere. And this lasted for several years. And this would have, again, shut down photosynthesis, led to severe cooling, and that would have collapsed the global food chain, killing off our iconic dinosaurs. And the killing off of these non-avian dinosaurs and many other taxa as well then paved the way for mammals to rise to dominance in ecosystems. And that is what we still see today. Mammals are the dominant terrestrial large vertebrates. So at each of these extinction events, we can examine the species and the groups that went extinct and those that didn't go extinct. And this information can give us a sense of the kill mechanism, so what caused those extinctions. And it can also tell us what type of taxa are generally vulnerable to particular types of environmental change. And what we see for most mass extinction events is that tropical extinction rates were elevated. This should make intuitive sense to you now because we discussed how the tropics often become way too hot to sustain life. And we also see really high extinction of reefal organisms during mass extinction events, particularly at the end of the Triassic. And again, this should make sense to you if these extinctions were caused by ocean acidification and if harmful UVB rays were being able to come through our atmosphere and shut down photosynthetic organisms. We also see by looking to the fossil record that extinction can be predicted to a high degree by examining the geographic range of a species. So a species' geographic range is the area over which a species is found. And species that have broad geographic ranges, like this cute red fox here, are more likely to survive extinction events than those with small geographic ranges, like the giant panda here. And this, in fact, this relationship, the fact that geographic range size is a really good predictor of extinction risk, is actually something that we see consistently throughout the fossil record. And it's actually a more important predictor than breadth of resource use or breadth of tolerance. And that's really interesting because although these two variables are often related, they don't exhibit a one-to-one correspondence. And so we can actually disentangle which is most important in predicting which taxa go extinct by looking to the fossil record. And what we find is that geographic range size, so the space that a species occupies, is actually more important than that breadth of tolerances that it has. Okay, so mass extinctions are, we talked about in the fossil record, are caused by the knock-on effects of greenhouse gases emitted by large igneous provinces. And today, of course, it's no surprise, should be no surprise to you that humans are emitting large amounts of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into Earth's atmosphere. And these anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide and other gases have already caused an approximately 1 degree Celsius increase in global mean temperature since pre-industrial times. And these increases in CO2, like in the past when we saw these mass extinction events, is also causing depletion of the ozone. It's also causing depletion of oxygen from oceans. It's also causing acidification. And sadly, along with habitat destruction, it's likely accelerating rates of extinction of groups of both animals and plants. So the question then becomes that we might want to ask ourselves, are we beginning or are we already in the midst of a sixth mass extinction, similar to the mass extinctions that have occurred in the distant past? We can actually project how climate will change in the future based on the amount of greenhouse gases that humans have already emitted, as well as scenarios for how many or how much greenhouse gas will emit in the future. And these emissions are then plugged into sophisticated global climate models that couple various Earth system processes to estimate the effect of these emissions on climate. And this is just one example of an estimate from a model. And what you can see, these are different scenarios, emission scenarios. RCP6 is a fairly sort of bad emission scenario, meaning that we don't curb greenhouse gases and continue to pollute as we are doing now. Whereas RCP 2.6 is fairly a good emission scenario in the sense that we get our act together as society and reduce emissions fairly significantly. But you can see that regardless of the scenario, even if we're doing quite well and we reduce our emissions fairly rapidly and quickly as a society, we're still going to experience at least 1 to 2 degrees more change or increase in temperature in the next 80 or so years. And this increase, of course, is nowhere near the 10 degrees Celsius of warming that occurred at the end of the Permian during the Great Dying Event, which is great news for us, but it's still a significant amount of change. And based on this projected warming that we can do under a variety of these emission scenarios, we can look at how portions of the globe will fare in terms of heat stress. And essentially, large portions of the globe will likely be so hot that humans will find it really uncomfortable to potentially intolerable to be outside. So these maps are showing you the mean number of months per year when the mean universal thermal climate index exceeds 38 degrees Celsius. So what does that mean? Well, this index essentially takes into account ambient temperature, humidity, solar and thermal radiation, and wind speed. And it provides a measure that reports the effect of these conditions on human comfort. And any value above 38 degrees Celsius is considered to exceed human comfort thresholds. And what you can see is that significant portions of the Earth are going to experience this by 2100, so in the next 80 years, especially so in the tropics. Not only are the tropics projected to experience higher temperatures that will lead to heat stress, but our top food crops or leading food crops will also likely be difficult to grow in the tropics or at low latitudes. So based on some fairly simplistic crop modeling, suitable area for crop growth is projected to shift poleward, so move away from the tropics, as well as to decline in overall area. At least for many of the crops that we considered. And these projected declines in suitable area for crop growth are particularly worrying, given that population projections, of course, may total anywhere between 7 to 16 billion by the year 2100. So of course, this is going to put additional stress on our food supplies. So in addition to estimating the effects of climate change on crop viability, we can also project how biodiversity may respond to these future climate changes. And one way we can do this is by defining the niches or tolerances of species based on the conditions that the species occupies. The niche of a species can be defined in many ways, but here I'm using a minimum volume ellipsoid drawn around temperature and precipitation conditions that a species occupies. And then we can generate these niche estimates for each species, a bird, mammal, amphibian, and reptile on Earth using knowledge of their distributions. And then we can map how these tolerances or suitable areas for species will change in the future under future climate change scenarios. And in our projections, we can model how biodiversity will fare if a species is allowed to disperse and to track those changes in suitable habitat. But we can also model how species will fare if we assume that they can't disperse and track suitable habitat. And of course, because we don't know precisely how climate will change in the future, we want to use a variety of possible emission scenarios and future climate change scenarios, as well as a variety of climate models. So this is what I'm showing you here. These are the climate models and emission scenarios for precipitation and temperature to the year 2100. And then using these scenarios, we could examine the areas that will become unsuitable for a species. And we can actually look at when they will become unsuitable and where they will become unsuitable. And this is referred to as species exposure. So this is essentially when the climatic conditions become potentially dangerous for a species. And I'm showing you here patterns for amphibian species, so aggregated across all amphibian species globally. And what you can see is that exposure becomes more severe the climate change scenario. Shouldn't be too surprising for you. And that it also, again, seems to be concentrated mostly in the tropics at low latitudes. Given predicted exposure to conditions outside their niche in the future, what then can we expect in terms of species extinction patterns and therefore overall levels of biodiversity? So what I'm showing you here on the left is current patterns of biodiversity for birds and for mammals. And the darker red is higher species diversity. And then on the right here, we have projections for how patterns of diversity may change under future climate change scenarios, both with dispersal and without dispersal. And what you can hopefully see is that in a world without dispersal, there will be far fewer species and the world will be quite depauperate. However, if we allow for dispersal, we might actually see increases in diversity in many parts of the world if species can keep pace with climate change. And that, of course, is a big if. Because one of the things that is happening right now is that climate is changing more rapidly than it has in the last 66 million years. So in fact, the last time that it changed more quickly than the rate of change occurring today is at the Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction event. So at the event where an asteroid slammed into Earth, caused massive amounts of dust to be ejected into the atmosphere and then darkened our skies for years. And at that point, when the asteroid hit Earth, there was extreme heat in the area of the asteroid and surrounding regions. And then very quickly thereafter, there was extreme cold. So that was the last time when climate changed more quickly than the changes that we're seeing today. So the answer of how biodiversity may fare under future climate change scenarios is dependent on whether species can track climate changes, but it's also dependent on whether we destroy remaining habitat areas for species and on a complex network of both ecological and biological interactions. So that's all to say that it's pretty complicated, but biodiversity could potentially look something like this. So even if this is allowing for dispersal. So even allowing for dispersal, you can see that some of the highest spots for biodiversity today, like the Amazon basin here, are expected to be much, much, much lower in diversity by 2100. Again, only in the next 80 or so years. And this is consistent with changes that we project for places like the Amazon in terms of biomes and in terms of its climate. So, for example, our modeling suggests that rising temperatures and disrupted rainfall pattern will actually render the Amazon basin unsuitable for tropical rainforests in the coming decades and centuries. Today, of course, the Amazon rainforest is home to more than 1/3 of all known species on Earth. It's a biodiversity hotspot. But in our model, for Amazon forest cover declines from about 71% in the present to about 63% in 2100. And then by 2500, forest cover is projected to be only 15%, being replaced by barren soil. And yes, I know 2500 is really far into the future, but these changes will are starting to happen even now. So The modeling that myself and my colleagues have done, these projections into the future for crops, for biodiversity, for temperature changes, share many similarities with our past mass extinction events that we discussed earlier. The warming of the tropics, destruction of ozone, large-scale input of greenhouse gases that are causing anoxia and ocean acidification. But there are important differences. So the Earth today is really different from how the Earth was during past mass extinction events, especially during the Permian and the Triassic. And for one, we don't have a supercontinent. So remember I said that in the Permian and the Triassic, we had this supercontinent called Pangaea. And the fact that we don't have a supercontinent is really good news, because it means that we can, the Earth system, our Earth today, can better regulate its climate state and can avoid overheating the tropics much more easily than it could back in this time. And there have actually been a lot of climatic upheavals in the past 66 million years that haven't caused mass extinction events. And this potentially, our continental configuration, may have a large role to play in that. Humans, of course, are also working to curb greenhouse gas emissions and to stop these changes from occurring so that we do avoid becoming like the Triassic or the Permian 200 million years ago. And humans are also, like myself and my colleagues, are trying to predict how our Earth systems will fare given the changes that we're bringing about to climate today. And we're doing this using various modeling, and we're doing it because we think we can potentially mitigate negative consequences of our actions and the changes that we're bringing about, and that we can potentially protect biodiversity. And of course, biodiversity is critical because we rely on it for our food, our medicine, and our shelter. And I would argue it also brings beauty to our world. So dispersal, I mentioned, is really important. And it's probably going to be vital to allow species to track their preferred climatic niches. And we can actually model the most likely dispersal corridors for species, which I'm showing you here. So blue is birds, red is mammals, green is amphibians, and orange are reptiles. And you can look at these potential dispersal corridors that are projected for how species might respond and track their suitable habitat. And based on these identified dispersal corridors, we can potentially give them conservation priority. We can also look to the fossil record to tell us about the likely changes that are expected to our Earth system and which taxa might be most vulnerable to those changes. And the information that we gather from the fossil record can be input into things like the IUCN Red List to better protect and conserve our biodiversity and our resources. So for example, like I said, geographic range size is one of the most important determiners of extinction risk. But we also learned from the fossil record that body size and trophic position are very important. So again, we can prioritize conservation efforts for those species that might be most vulnerable to a changing climate. And we also know how to solve the problems that we currently face. And that's probably the biggest challenge, is to actually know how to fix our problems. And we know how to do that. So we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We need to reduce our pollution. We need to reduce habitat destruction. And through the combined efforts of small changes that individuals make, we can actually make a large difference globally. We can stop eating as much meat as individuals. We can stop traveling so much as individuals. The pandemic does a good job of that for us. We can fit energy efficient appliances and products in our homes. We can stop using plastic. And again, these efforts and these actions make a massive difference when enacted collectively. So the current COVID pandemic is obviously awful, and it's affecting all of our lives, and we urgently need a vaccine. And we just had some really great news from Oxford about that today. But it's actually a very tiny blip in Earth history. So scaled again to English monarchs, COVID has actually been around for only the last 7.6 seconds of the current Queen's reign. And even though it might seem to us like it's been around forever, the lesson from the fossil record tells us that pandemics, even given massive volcanism, even given asteroid impacts, life will persist. The question is whether human life will persist, and if it does, the quality of that life or the life humans will have. And so while it might be the end of the world as we know it, it likely won't be the end of life as we know it. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I'd like to thank all of these fabulous people who have helped with this research, and I will take questions. So I have some questions, I think, that have come into the chat. And one of the questions that I received was whether concerted action to help species, so doing relocations or planning conservation efforts, is worthwhile, or whether it actually has more unintended consequences than we realize. And I think this is a really important question. And essentially, the question gets at this premise that our ecosystems and our Earth are this interconnected entity and system. And so when you start to place new things or mess with certain links in that interconnected system, you can have massive knock-on effects. What I would argue is that we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we need to reduce habitat disruption, and we need to try to preserve as many species as we can. And we need to do that with the least amount of sort of meddling in that ecosystem structure as possible. Other questions that I received, let me see if I can get to them, so have you studied the correlation between evidence for impacts of objects from space and disappearance of species on Earth? There has been much discussion about the possibility that a large impact led to the extinction of the dinosaurs. Well, you learned today that it did. Are there other examples at other times in Earth history when this happened? And that's a really good question. And geologists and paleontologists like myself have been trying to find out whether other asteroid impacts, could have caused previous mass extinction events. We don't actually have very much evidence of this. So there's not strong evidence to support asteroid impacts linked to the previous mass extinction events. But it definitely is something that paleontologists are intrigued by, and that geologists are intrigued by, and that we are still investigating. But to date, only the KPG mass extinction is definitively linked to an asteroid impact. Another question that I received is, has there been any previous mass extinctions where species have disappeared at a faster rate than currently? And again, the answer is yes. Right now, species are disappearing. The rate is alarming. People debate, and by people I mean paleontologists and biologists, debate whether we truly are in a sixth mass extinction right now. The rate is accelerating, but whether that rate is equivalent with previous mass extinction events is much debated. And I would argue that the rate at which species went extinct at the KPG was probably much higher, because you did have this massive change that was very rapid and very sudden. And as I mentioned in the talk, the last 66 million years ago when climate actually changed faster than it changed today. So today is changing very rapidly, more rapidly than in the last 66 million years of Earth history. But at the KPG, it changed even more rapidly. So that probably caused an even faster rate of extinction. Other questions that I received is, if you were to change one of your day-to-day activity to help slow climate change, what would have the most impact? That's a really excellent question. Traveling is a huge emitter of greenhouse gases. So if you were to really try to change one thing in your life, reducing the amount of travel that you do, and you trying to use public transport when you do it and avoid flying is probably the biggest thing. But that's just my opinion. And certainly I would urge you to try to enact as many of the things as you can to be more sustainable. So another question I received is, to what extent is overpopulation in the future going to be a factor? I think it's certainly going to be a factor and affect the amount of resources that we have, as well as the biodiversity on Earth. So the more people, of course, on Earth, the less space that other species have and the less resources other species have. And so this is something that we really need to solve, is our overpopulation problem. Projections into the future, into 2100, as I said, vary very dramatically. And certainly we're going to be able as a society to deal with these changes if our population levels are lower. There will be more resources available. Yeah, so another question is, how did life and diversity recover following these mass extinction events? That's a great question. And the answer is that it recovered very slowly after most of these mass extinction events. It sometimes took up to 2 to 3 million years for diversity levels and for ecological structures and ecosystems to be at a level that was equivalent to that before the mass extinction. So yes, life recovered. Yes, we had the evolution of many new taxa. We had new ecosystem structures, but it often would take millions of years for that to happen. Let's see, other questions. Let's see. So another question is, how does diversity recover after mass extinction? So it works quite well within this context. Or with the previous question rather, and essentially life evolves, so we have and changes over time, and so those taxa that did survive, so those species that did make it through these mass extinction events, then went on to proliferate and to evolve over time, over millions of years. And so it just took time for our climate systems and our Earth systems to get to a state that was habitable again, and to support life, and the life that did persist then was able to take off and evolve. Let's see, other questions. So another question is, given that the fossil record is incomplete, how do you take this into account when calculating extinction rates for previous mass extinction events? And that's a really good question. So the fossil record is incomplete. So essentially, a famous analogy that Darwin used is that the fossil record is like a book or a novel with some of its pages ripped out. So we don't have perfect knowledge of all species on Earth. We don't have perfect knowledge of all environmental changes on Earth. We don't have perfect knowledge, therefore, of extinction rates. And so what we can do is a variety of statistical approaches and subsampling to get at what we think might have been the extinction rate. And the extinction rates that I was presenting are mostly for marine shelly invertebrates. And that means that they have hard parts, they're shelly, and so they preserve well in the fossil record. So we can have a better idea of their extinction rates than, say, insects or soft-bodied organisms. So we might be underestimating actually the amount of extinction that occurred because we often have that missing record that we can extrapolate, but we're never going to perfectly be able to estimate the true value. Let's see, another question. So another question I got is, I'm aware it's open to debate, but would you say that we are currently experiencing a 6th mass extinction event? It is open to debate, as I said in the talk, and I'm not going to come down yes or no on this, and I think my cop-out answer is that yes, we could experience a 6th mass extinction if we aren't careful and if we don't act now, and so I think we don't want to experience that, both in terms of the fact that we do rely on biodiversity for our food, our resources to clean our water, to provide us with shelter, but also, as I said, it makes our world worth living and it makes it a more beautiful place. So I would say that we should definitely try to do as much as we can to avoid entering into a sixth mass extinction event if we not, or mitigating it if we already are in it. So I think that given we are due an address by the leader of this nation, I might close off the questioning, but I'd just like to thank everyone again for coming to this talk and for all of the excellent questions. And I think, Ailish, you were going to say something at the very end.
Thank you very much indeed. That was an absolutely wonderful lecture, Erin. I'm sure everyone appreciates it. It was utterly compelling throughout, and I'm glad that my commute tonight will be an ecologically friendly one as I walk across the gardens from my study here in the college over to the lodgings. Many, many thanks indeed. I'm sure all of our audience out there, the hundreds of you out there, will have appreciated just how lucky we are to have Erin here at St Hugh's. She's an inspiration to her students and to her colleagues, and her research is obviously critical to all of us. And I very much hope that we can take a more optimistic view and that we do something and act now on your advice and guidance. To all of you out there, thank you so much for attending. I'm sure you'll share my view on the lecture. We've had a fabulous series of academic lectures this term. We look forward to having an equally fabulous series next term, and I hope you will join us. We also have this Sunday coming our Christmas Carol service. For those of you who'd like to attend, it'll be clearly a virtual service this year, but it would be lovely to have you with us, and I hope that each and every one of you will stay safe and have a wonderful holiday period to come. Thank you very much indeed. Good night.